There are moments in history that don't arrive with noise. No sirens, no chaos, no warning, just a phone, ringing in the dark. Some say it was late at night, when the city had already slowed down and the streets of Harlem were quieter than usual. Others believe it was earlier, just another ordinary moment that didn't feel important at the time. But every version agrees on one thing. When Frank Lucas picked up that phone, something shifted. Not immediately. Not in a way anyone else could see, but deep beneath the surface, something irreversible had begun. The room was still, the kind of stillness that powerful men often surround themselves with. No unnecessary noise, no distractions, just control, everything in its place. That's how Frank liked it. For years, he had built a system that didn't rely on chaos. While others operated loudly, drawing attention, inviting conflict, Frank moved in silence. His strength wasn't in aggression, it was in precision. Every move calculated. Every connection intentional. Every risk measured. People didn't just fear him, they respected him. Because in a world filled with unpredictable men, Frank Lucas was something rare. Predictable not in weakness, but in discipline. And discipline creates power. But that night, as the phone rang, something about the moment felt different. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Because men like Frank Lucas don't rush, don't react without thinking. Even something as simple as answering a phone, there's timing to it. And timing is everything. Finally, he reached for it. Slow, controlled, intentional. He picked up the receiver. Silence. Then a voice. Calm, measured, almost ordinary. But there was something beneath it. Something that didn't need to be said out loud. The kind of tone that carries weight without effort. The kind of tone that makes even the most composed men listen carefully. Frank didn't interrupt. He never did. He listened. Some say the voice belonged to someone close, someone trusted, someone who had been part of the system for years. Others believe it was someone unexpected, a voice that shouldn't have known what it knew. But whoever it was, they understood something important. They understood where to strike, because in a world built on power, information is more dangerous than force. The conversation didn't last long. No shouting, no threats, no dramatic pause. Just words. Simple words, but words that carried consequences far beyond the moment. Frank's expression didn't change. Not visibly. He didn't react the way most people would. No sudden movements. No visible tension. Just the same calm presence he always carried. But inside, something moved. Not fear. Not panic. Awareness. The kind of awareness that comes when a man realizes something has shifted beyond his control. Because for years, Frank Lucas had controlled everything. The flow, the structure, the system. He had eliminated uncertainty, removed unnecessary risks, built something that felt untouchable. But in that moment, he understood something. Nothing is untouchable. Not forever. Some say he already knew this day would come. That men like him don't build empires without understanding the cost. Others believe this moment caught even him off guard, that no matter how prepared you are, there are always variables you can't predict. Either way, the effect was immediate. Not outwardly, but internally. His mind began moving faster. Not in panic, but in calculation. Every connection, every decision, every person in his circle, re-evaluated in an instant. Because the call didn't just bring information. It brought doubt, and doubt is the beginning of collapse. He said very little in return. Just enough to acknowledge. Just enough to maintain control. Then, he hung up. Silence returned to the room, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was heavier, more aware, as if the air itself understood something had changed. Frank didn't move right away. He stayed still, thinking, processing, adjusting. Because men like him don't react emotionally, they adapt. But even adaptation has limits. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of everything he had built, something had already begun to crack. Not visibly, not yet, but enough to start a chain reaction. Because empires don't fall all at once. They fall in stages. Quiet ones, invisible ones, and then irreversible ones. That phone call wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Within hours, small changes began to appear, subtle, almost unnoticeable. A delay here, a hesitation there. Nothing dramatic but enough to feel. Frank adjusted quickly. He always did. He tightened certain things, rechecked others, moved pieces quietly, without drawing attention. But something was different this time. The control he once held so effortlessly now required effort, and effort means resistance. Somewhere, something wasn't aligning the way it used to. And in a system built on precision, even the smallest misalignment can become dangerous. Very dangerous. The people around him didn't see it. Not clearly, they still saw the same man, the same calm presence, the same authority. But they felt it because power, when it shifts, creates a tension that others can sense even if they don't understand it. Some began to question silently. Others began to observe more closely, and a few started to distance themselves, not out of disloyalty, but out of instinct. Because in that world, survival isn't about loyalty, it's about timing, and timing was beginning to change. Frank knew it, he didn't say it, he didn't show it, but he understood. Something very clearly, whatever that phone call had set in motion, couldn't be stopped, only managed, only delayed, only survived, if survival was even possible. 7 days, that's how long it would take. 7 days for everything to begin unraveling. 7 days for trust to become uncertainty. 7 days for control to turn into pressure. 7 days for an empire to start collapsing from within. And the most unsettling part, at that moment, standing in that silent room, with nothing but the memory of a voice still echoing in his mind, it didn't look like anything had changed. No alarms, no chaos, no visible threat, just a man. And a realization that sometimes the most dangerous events don't arrive with force. They arrive quietly, through a voice, through a moment, through a single decision, made somewhere else. A decision that reaches you without warning, without permission, and without a way back. Because, in the end, it wasn't the call itself that destroyed the empire. It was what the call revealed, something hidden, something inevitable, something that had been building long before that moment ever came. And as the silence settled deeper into the room, one question remained, unanswered, unavoidable. Was this betrayal? Or simply the moment when power finally turned against itself? Before power had a new name, it already had a presence. Not loud, not reckless, but absolute. Bumpy Johnson. In Harlem. That name didn't need explanation. It didn't travel through whispers that lived in them. It moved through conversations without ever being spoken to loudly. Because when a name carries real weight, people don't use it carelessly. Respect it. Some say Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem with intelligence that few could match. That he understood the streets not as chaos, but as a system, a pattern, something that could be controlled if you knew where to apply pressure, and where to remain silent. Others believe it wasn't intelligence alone. They say fear did most of the work. But fear, on its own, doesn't last. Not in a place like Harlem. Fear fades, it weakens, it gets challenged, and when it does, everything built on it collapses. Bumpy Johnson understood that. That's why he didn't rely on fear alone. He relied on balance, respect, backed by consequence, control, reinforced by patience. He didn't move often, but when he did, people noticed. Not because of noise, but because of timing. Every action felt deliberate. Every decision felt final. There was no rush in him, and in a world where everyone was chasing something, that made him different, that made him dangerous. Harlem didn't just operate under Bumpy Johnson, it adapted to him. The streets learned his rhythm. The people learned his silence. Even the chaos learned where its limits were. Because chaos, when faced with structure, eventually bends. And Bumpy Johnson was structure. But even in the presence of a man like that, there are always others watching, learning, waiting. And somewhere in that carefully controlled world, stood Frank Lucas, not in the spotlight, not in the position of power, but always there, close enough to see everything, far enough to remain unnoticed. Frank Lucas wasn't the kind of man people talked about back then. He didn't demand attention. He didn't try to stand out. And that's exactly what made him valuable. Because men who don't need attention usually don't need permission either. He moved quietly, followed instructions without hesitation, did what was required, and nothing more. At least that's what it looked like. But beneath that surface, something else was happening. Frank was watching. Not casually, not passively, but carefully. He paid attention to things others ignored. The pauses in Bumpy's speech, the moments when decisions weren't made immediately, the situations where silence carried more weight than words. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't explain himself. He didn't need to. And that forced people like Frank to think, to interpret, to understand. Some say this is where everything truly began, not with ambition, but with awareness. Because once you begin to understand power, you start to see its structure, and once you see its structure, you begin to question it. Frank noticed patterns. He saw how problems were handled before they became visible, how conflicts were avoided rather than confronted, how control wasn't maintained through force but through anticipation. It wasn't just leadership, it was design, and Frank Lucas was learning that design piece by piece. But learning doesn't always mean loyalty. Sometimes it means preparation. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. Frank remained consistent, reliable, quiet. He didn't challenge Bumpy, didn't compete, didn't step out of line. But inside, something was building, not impatience, not rebellion. Something far more dangerous to understanding, because understanding changes everything. It shifts the way you see decisions, the way you interpret actions, the way you measure strength and weakness, and slowly, almost invisibly, Frank Lucas began to change. He wasn't just following anymore. He was analyzing. Every move Bumpy made became a lesson. Every situation became an example. Every silence became a message. And over time, those lessons started forming something bigger. A mindset. One that didn't just accept power, but questioned how it worked. Some say Bumpy noticed this shift, that he saw something in Frank that others didn't. A depth, a focus, a quiet intensity that didn't match the typical men around him. Others believe he didn't, that he saw loyalty, and trusted it, because in a world built on control, trust is often a calculated risk. And sometimes that risk goes unnoticed, but whether Bumpy Johnson saw it or not, the reality remained the same. Frank Lucas was no longer just part of the system. He was beginning to understand it, and once you understand something deeply enough, you stop fearing it, you stop depending on it, you start seeing where it can be, improve, change, rebuilt. That's the moment everything shifts. Not outwardly, but internally, because the most dangerous transformations don't happen in front of people. They happen quietly, in thought, in observation, and in the shadow of a man like Bumpy Johnson. Frank Lucas was evolving, not into a rival, not yet, but into something just as powerful. A man who didn't just respect the system, but was slowly preparing to outgrow it. Because shadows don't stay shadows forever. Eventually, they step into the light, and when they do, they don't just follow power, they become it. There's a difference between learning and preparing. Most men never understand it. They follow, they repeat, they survive, but they never truly see. Frank Lucas saw everything from the outside. Nothing about him suggested ambition. He didn't compete for attention. He didn't try to prove himself. In a world where men measured power through noise and presence, Frank remained quiet, almost invisible, and that invisibility became his greatest advantage, because when no one sees you as a threat, they stop watching you, and when they stop watching, you start learning freely. At first, it looked like loyalty. Frank followed Bumpy Johnson without hesitation. He carried out instructions with precision. He respected the structure, the order, the discipline that Bumpy had built over years. But respect can evolve, and when it does, it becomes something else, something more calculated. Frank wasn't just executing orders anymore, he was studying them. Every decision Bumpy made, Frank would break it down in his mind. Not just what happened, but why it happened. Why certain problems were ignored, why others were handled immediately, why some people were trusted, and others kept at a distance. He began to see patterns, not obvious ones, subtle ones, the kind that only reveal themselves to those who are patient enough to wait. And Frank Lucas was patient. He noticed that power wasn't about reacting, it was about anticipating. It wasn't about showing strength, it was about controlling perception. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to prove anything, because his presence already meant something. That realization stayed with Frank, and slowly, it began to reshape him. Some say this is where the shift truly began, not in action, but in mindset. Because once you understand that power is psychological, You stop chasing it physically, you start building it. Internally, Frank started making small decisions on his own. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, just slight adjustments. Faster responses, cleaner execution, more efficient outcomes. And each time, it worked better than expected. That's when something changed. Confidence. Not loud, not visible. Present. And confidence, when mixed with intelligence, becomes something dangerous. Because now, Frank wasn't just following a system. He was improving it quietly, without permission, without recognition. Some say Bumpy noticed this, that he saw the difference in how Frank operated. The subtle efficiency, the way problems seemed to disappear before they fully formed. Others believe he didn't, that he saw reliability, and nothing more. Because that's the thing about transformation. It doesn't announce itself, it hides inconsistency. And Frank Lucas remained consistent. But inside, he was evolving. He began to understand something deeper. That power, no matter how strong, always has weaknesses. Not obvious ones. Hidden ones. The kind that only reveal themselves over time. And Frank had time. He watched how trust was given, how it was tested, how it was sometimes misplaced. He saw where systems depended too much on certain people, where decisions relied on assumptions rather than certainty. And instead of pointing these things out, he remembered them. Stored them, because information, when held long enough, becomes strategy, and strategy becomes power. There were moments, small ones, where Frank could have stepped forward, could have suggested changes, could have shown what he was seeing, but he didn't, because he understood something most people didn't. Timing. Knowing something isn't enough. You have to know when to use it. And Frank Lucas was waiting. Not for permission, not for opportunity, but for alignment, for the moment when everything he had learned would matter. Some say this was ambition, others say it was inevitability, because when a man sees the system clearly, he can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee something, you can't go back to simply following. You start thinking differently, acting differently, preparing differently. Frank Lucas was no longer just a part of Bumpy Johnson's world. He was becoming something separate. Not in position, not yet, but in mindset. And mindset is where real power begins. He started imagining alternatives, better structures, cleaner operations, systems that didn't rely on unnecessary risk. He began to see how things could be, not just how they were. And that vision stayed with him. Quietly, constantly, like a blueprint forming in the background. Some say this is the moment where loyalty ended. Others believe loyalty never truly disappears. It just changes form. Because Frank still respected, Bumpy still followed. Him still operated within his system. But now he understood it, and understanding creates distance. Because once you understand the rules, you realize they can be rewritten. That's the moment everything changes. Not outwardly, but internally. And internal changes are the most dangerous ones, because no one sees them coming. Frank Lucas didn't become powerful overnight. He became aware, and awareness is the first step toward control. The streets didn't notice it, the people didn't talk about it, nothing looked different, but everything was, because the student was no longer just learning, he was preparing for a moment no one else could see, a moment where observation would turn into action, where patience would turn into movement, where silence would finally speak. And when that moment came, it wouldn't feel sudden, it would feel inevitable, because the most dangerous men aren't the ones who chase power. They're the ones who understand it so deeply that when they finally move, looks like they were always meant to. When Bumpy Johnson was no longer there, the streets didn't erupt. They paused, not out of respect alone, but uncertainty. Because when a man like Bumpy disappears, he doesn't just leave space behind. He leaves a system, a structure so deeply embedded that no one knows exactly how to replace it. Some rushed forward, others waited, but Frank Lucas observed that because he understood something most didn't. Power doesn't transfer to the fastest, it transfers to the most prepared. And Frank Lucas had been preparing for years. He didn't step forward immediately. That would have been expected. Predictable was something he had spent his entire life avoiding. Instead, he moved quietly. He began reinforcing connections, not loudly, not publicly, just enough to ensure that when decisions needed to be made, his name was already part of the conversation. He didn't replace Bumpy's system, He refined it. Where there had been layers, he removed them. Where there had been delays, he eliminated them. Where there had been dependency, he created control. It wasn't a takeover, it was an evolution. Some say this is what made his rise so effective. There was no clear moment where Frank Lucas became powerful. No single event people could point to one day. He simply was. Operations became smoother. Decisions became faster. The kind of friction that once slowed things down disappeared. And people noticed, not immediately, but gradually, because of efficiency. As a way of revealing itself over time, Frank didn't demand respect. He earned it through results. Things worked better under him, cleaner, more precise, more predictable, and in a world filled with unpredictability, that kind of control becomes valuable. Very valuable. Fear followed, but not in the way most expected. This wasn't the loud, aggressive fear that came from violence. This was quieter, more calculated. The kind of fear that comes when people realize mistakes are no longer tolerated. Not because of punishment, but because inefficiency itself had no place anymore. Frank Lucas wasn't building chaos. He was building order, and order is harder to challenge. Some say this made him different, that he wasn't just another man chasing power, he was redesigning what power looked like. Others believe it made it be him vulnerable, because the more precise a system becomes, the less room it has for error, and no system is perfect. But in that moment, perfection is exactly what it looked like. Everything aligned, connections held, operations flowed. Control remained steady, but Frank had done something rare. He didn't just survive the system Bumpy Johnson left behind, he improved it, and in doing so, he became something more than just a successor. He became a new standard. But standards attract attention, and attention brings pressure. At first it was distant, almost unnoticeable. Just small shifts in the environment, questions being asked, movements being watched, nothing direct, nothing immediate, but enough. Because in a world like this, success doesn't stay invisible forever. The more efficient Frank became, the more visible he became. And visibility comes with consequences. Some say this is where the first real risk appeared, not in what Frank was doing, but in how well he was doing it. Because the better you operate, the more people want to understand how. And once they start looking closely, they start finding things, patterns, connections, details that weren't meant to be seen. Frank Lucas knew this. He understood that power isn't just about building something strong. It's about knowing when that strength becomes a liability. But by then, the momentum was already there. The system was running. The structure was established, and stepping back wasn't an option. Because once you reach that level, there is no quiet exit, only continuation, or collapse. And somewhere beyond the control of even the most calculated man, things were beginning to move. Not against him, not yet, but toward him. Because in a world built on observation, strategy, and silent power, no rise goes unnoticed forever. And every system, no matter how perfect it seems, eventually gets tested. The only question is, when?